Hello and most welcome to 853 of the H series. We are experiencing a rather lovely spring day here, early spring. You can feel in the air that there is actually a little scent of flowers going around somewhere. Although the dandelions haven't come yet. I'm quite sure they're on the way. For me, they always make a lovely salad with some vinegar, oil, and nice cuts of onion, some garlic, and some chives. Lovely salad. I can honestly recommend it. But don't go over your head and put in cheese and ham. Something that would just take out that lovely freshness of the dandelion leaves. And there is an oddity about the dandelion leaves. Every plant is a new species. I don't remember the name of this process, but I still understand it. That means that once you used one dandelion, one plant, and you felt it to be very tasty, delightful, the next one you try could be quite different. It could be bitter. So that's an oddity. Well, it's a bit nervous. I will try to do my very first deconstruction of a subject I never tried before. And as always, as I can recommend, do the choice by random. Do not choose something that you yourself had some inspiration to do. Let at least the first couple of choices be completely random. Otherwise, you will always run into the chance that you limit the deconstruction. It should be fresh, it should be something new, and it should also be something that is not controlled by what you already know. After that, you're more than welcome to put everything you know and everything you want into the subject. And actually, you will also notice that your own opinions become stronger, because this is the inherent nature of asymmetric thinking. Asymmetric thinking is a term coming from Edward de Bono, but it is sharing similarities with deconstruction. Edward de Bono, who passed away last year, sadly enough, was also a practitioner of deconstruction in his own way. And although he tried to explain what he was looking for in the book, I Am Right, You Are Wrong, How to Break the Black and White Thinking, his method never ever became clear to me until I read the book of Rudolf Gachet. Celebrations is not enough to show my gratitude to this great man. And to just the very oddity that a person from Luxembourg could be so insightful into deconstruction. Not that I have anything against Luxembourg. Well, it's one of the richest countries in the world. And I think, if I'm not misnoming myself, the Duke of Luxembourg is the second richest royalty in the world. But it is still a small country, and when it comes to the significance in thinking, it's, because of its sheer size, something less than important. Well, as you can tell, I'm nervous. I'm trying to avoid the subject and the doing. Worried, how is it going to go? What will this end in? Well, let's cut to the chase. I will deconstruct psychology and certain traits in psychology. And I would say that there is a division made up somewhere, and that division can be deconstructed, it can be revealed for what it is, and it can thereby become healed. It is when we understand when this chiasma or cataclysm in the text evolves, then we also understand how it can be healed. And I would say the understanding is the healing. It's the very same thing. And it's not a project that is from the beginning something that always succeed. It's not a method in that way. It is a movement in the hope of healing the chiasma. If I lack the knowledge, or the knowledge is not in the text either, it can therefore neither be healed. But there is always a sort of a opportunity for healment, and it's better to sort of be able to acknowledge the healment and bring it to fruition. What could the division be here? Where is the chiasma? Well, I'm going to lean into this in the easiest possible way. And I would say that in psychology, I think it all started with a copying of medicine. And in general medicine, the person being the doctor often has a white coat. That white coat often follows into psychology, or at least psychiatry, even though it's quite unnecessary. The white coat is to protect the person from blood stain and also be easy to wash, as or to kill off the viruses and bacteria and whatnots. But I would say there is an obvious copying here. And there is an idea that the patient suffering from some sort of psychological affection is similar to a patient that is suffering from a medical ailment. Let's say an infection of the leg. You only heal the leg. You don't have to go into what the person is doing or the general health of the person in any advanced way. Just have to make sure it's not anything seriously wrong with the person as a whole. And then you can go on to put a bandage on the wound or something like that. And obviously I think it's, at least especially in the beginning of psychology, was something similar, but instead of directly healing the patient with putting on a bandage, you talk to him or her, but you still saw it that the thing the person was suffering from, whether it was, let's say, neurosis or depression or melancholia, that was something that was going on inside the patient, and that you could isolate the patient from its surrounding reality somehow. The ailment, the disease was within the person, and the person needed to get healed. But what was happening outside the person, that was a completely different matter. That is the outside. Could be something that is treated by another subject, maybe sociology or ethnology, or if you're a foreigner, anthropology, and so forth. That is not part of the psychological problem. The psychological problem is within the person. And we see here how divisions occur arbitrarily. Nobody said that this division should be here. Nobody hypothesized them. They just are there. And here is the thirst trait, the first little indication that something funny is going on. Nobody said anything. The divisions has always already been there. That in between psyche and soma, that between body and mind, that between the inner of a person and the outer. And as always, when we come to already always there, it is arbitrarily. And it's not even definable. The border is not clear because nobody spoke about these things. Nobody have ever thought about them. They're just there. Well, does this sound like a regular chiasma or not? I'd say it does. Here we have this typical rapture of the page, the rapture of the text, the rapture of reality. And of course, in some obvious sense, the outside and the inside go hand in hand. When we have distinctions, they should be made for a reason, not because they are always already there, not because they are part of reality. We need to see the things we want to do, the things we are interacting with, as something that we decide. We should not let them decide themselves. And as always, there is no intention. It's this very nature of it being a happenstance, randomness. And I would say it's usually two sides of this thing. You can compare that to a mirror. The mirror image doesn't have a clear dividing line where the mirror image is and where the person starts. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it doesn't make any sense to make a dividing line. There's two things that are arbitrarily done. They are by happenstance and nobody ever thought about them. And these are sine qua non for the chiasma. This is the nature of the chiasma. If someone had have decided it should be this way, it would have been different. It would have been spoken, it would have been intended, it would be something of the world, so to speak, or at least of the known world. But these things are just there. And they cause havoc on the system. And the havoc is arbitrarily and therefore makes it very hard to get any knowledge from it. Let me compare this to the wound in the leg. I talked about a doctor. Maybe we have a doctor who's not having a good eyesight. He might point to the wrong area of the leg and say, here's the wound, let's treat that. Here, it's another problem. Somebody's pointing wrong, and that can actually be corrected. Maybe it won't happen, but it can. There is a possibility. But in the first case, when you have a completely arbitrary division, never intended, it becomes impossible to change it. because how would you know about it? You cannot know about it, and therefore it has a power about you. So the very nature of it not being hypothesized, decided, or intended, that's at the very root of the problem. No one ever said it should be this way. No one ever intended it to be this way. It is not coming from thinking, perceiving, sensing, being, doing, intending, having a goal. I think you get the drift here. Whereas in the case of the leg and the wound, there is an intention. It could be wrong or partly wrong, but there is an intention. And that is the difference. But it can now be healed. Could not before. That's also important to realize. Before we know about it, it cannot be healed. Otherwise you live in complete fantasy, and then you won't realize what is deconstruction or the method of healing. Of course, some of these things has sort of sieved up and has come to the surface. But far from all of them, and I think already in this, well, it's not really even a division. Even that is a misnomer in some way. It's not even a division. Because when we use the word division, we imply that to be something that can be done, that has at least some relevance or something in the world, or something that it is very, very sneaky, this thing. It's very sneaky, and of course this is the reason for it to have been unobservable and unobserved for 2,500 years. Here, of course, I'm in agreement with Heidegger, the amnesia, and also with Jacques Derrida. The chiasma has always already been there. It was never intended, but it is there. There it is. The second move is to describe it, and now we will still use the language of division or the chiasma language to do that, but it is sort of the first healing movement. Look at the problems. If the person thinks that the psychological, so to speak, disease or whatever is within him or her, how can he change then? How do you reach into the inside? If this division is arbitrarily made, you can never ever do that. You cannot heal yourself from the inside, and neither can the people trying to help you. There is no such thing as an inside per se. Of course there is an inside in other aspect, but with this unborn division, I would like to call it unborn, because it was never established as something. You cannot get healed, and of course, let me just mention logical examples here. What it leads to the person waiting for him or her to be healed inside until that person can start to work, do things more properly. The outside will be dependent on the inside, and that the inside gets healed, and a sort of want starts, and that wanting is to be one piece once more. So it's exaggerated, it's being exaggerated by this very division. So instead of making the patient better, patient becomes locked into something that it cannot define, cannot point to, or cannot change either. Of course, division is completely arbitrary. How could the person change? So instead of the person actually doing something to get better, how about doing things that are helpful, healthy things, things that leads to consequences that are good? And all of a sudden that person will see, in some respects, thinking supposed to be the inside and doing is not at all different. Actually, it is the very same thing in some aspects. The very same thing. I think in some ways it's absolutely obvious. Something that is coming from thinking, how could that be a limitation? It cannot. It must be something that is not coming from thinking, not coming from hypothesizing, not coming from a theory. It's being before, and that is also the reason it remained unobserved. Unobserved because its very nature makes it unobservable. One could say it's a perceivable part of reality, or it can be perceivable, but it can never ever be something that somebody says. Cannot be part of an ideology, cannot be part of a thinking system, can't be part of a thesis, can't be a proposition, it can't even be a proper thought, and it can definitely not be perception. Actually cannot be perception itself. And this is of course the reason why it becomes so tricky to understand. By defining it, you are missing out completely. You are dead wrong for every defining movement. You need to go around, because it's not even an it. While you hear now how tricky it is. You need to trod carefully, and God, I have to tell you in the beginning, I cannot be careful because this is new to me, and this is an interesting process for me, because this is about progressing. For me, all my life, learning has been of just cashing in things, not progressing yourself, not making knowledge bigger, not becoming smarter, wiser, developing. No, because of this unspoken arbitrary model that casts its shadow whether we like it or not. Progression itself is impossible. Remember the dialogues. Socrates is showing no progress is possible. And this is also the reason we more and more take in the path of this sterile idea of knowledge. Almost like money in the bank. It could be comparable in some ways, actually. The comparison doesn't hold in all aspects, but in some. If, for instance, I have a bank account and for some reason there would be 10 times as much money, it wouldn't affect me if I didn't know about it. This is how knowledge works these days. It's not something that has anything to do with you as a person. There is no intimacy because of the divisions. You have the knowledge somewhere else. and that somewhere else is undefined, unlocalizable. Unlocalizable. It is not put somewhere. And maybe the idea or the gestalt I'm trying to get through here, the absolute arbitrariness, will sort of be clearer. It is completely random, doesn't get any more random, and all of a sudden the tables are changed. At least for me they were. Sorry for digressing here, but my view on Derrida has always been very the thing of admiration. I always found him to be this virus inhabiting the text, taking the shape of the text as a virus do. If you get a virus in your body, it will try to copycat the inside of your system, because the virus itself, it doesn't have a will by itself. Actually, the virus is not a living thing. It's somewhere in between life and death. Well, let me continue. Let's continue with the poor patient of psychological problems, whatever they could be. The idea of the psyche is something that haunts the soma. It haunts the body. The person knows something is not working, but the thing is unobservable because it's so small. It's not random in that way. It's just very small and therefore hard to observe. And we direct it to something unknown. We call it the psyche. We say it habits in the psyche. There the problems are. And the poor patient has to wait until that very day the inside, whatever that could be, gets healed. And then that person can return to his duties, do his chores, be excellent again and progress, be diligent, be wise, be able, be flexible. The tensions all of a sudden will disappear. Well, we all know it's not that easy. People never or very seldom get healed psychologically because it's an illusion in some parts. But it's not an illusion made from complete fantasy. That would have been still intended. No, it's coming from this arbitrary random setting. So where we need to make definitions and make borders and have borders, we don't do that because of this arbitrary setting. And we have the feeling this setting is making itself, and we don't have to do anything. We can sort of just observe it. And here is my deconstructed point. And you look at what is passive observance. Because before, I always seen the whole thing starting with passive observance. And therefore you get theory, and therefore you get this whole idea with the standstill world. But the opposite side must hold as well. It starts with the solidification of what was earlier open. It starts with the chiasm, and that creates the passivity. Let me rephrase that. This invention of a stable world, I call it stable. It is not stable because it's not perceivable as stable. It's a random, arbitrary thing. But that random, arbitrary thing, if we see it as two sides of something that needs to be deconstructed, that arbitrary random thing leads to the passivity. For if it weren't something that was undecided and random, by happenstance, arbitrary, you name it, the passivity never would have evolved. Choice, in a way, never would have sort of exit the scene. It would still be in the picture. So the very disappearance is an interesting thing, and that led to passivity. One way of seeing it, it started in the other pole, the other side of the polarity. I have always thought until now that the passivity was the starting point. It would be interesting to hear what Ian McGilchrist thinks about this, but I would say that he took terms for the passivity starting in the observing role, and it somehow started with this passivity. I would see this first little spore that started it can also be the randomness. The randomness gives you an idea it's happening outside your own sphere of influence in some ways. It needs to be random. And this randomness is the very objective sense. Because if it's partly subjective, it's not shared by everyone. It doesn't have this force, so to speak, of objectiveness. So something evolves from this arbitrary division, and it's the solidity, and that is the solidity itself. And that changes the table completely. I would say we're doing a live deconstruction now. That's more than I was anticipating or hoping for. That means that the whole philosophical history needs to be rearranged a bit. So all this idea about some philosophers says that everything is changed, and some other philosopher says that everything is stable, solidified, unmovable, permanent, and so forth, are actually the same thing. There's no difference here. And it's not so much a gamble or a fight between the two directions of solidify or everything being movement. It's participating in the same unguided dance, lack of better words. And this is more than similar to the psychology victim, the patient. The patient who has to wait until he gets healed inside. He has to listen eternally for the therapist to repeat the same litania over and over again until this mysterious inner thing is healed, instead of actually doing things that will heal the inside and the outside at the very same time. And that the outside can be completely different from the inside still. It's just a randomness that disavow for this simultaneous being different and very the same at the same time. And that's the idea of passivity. One side is passive, the other one is being what is observed. So these two things evolved at the very same time. All of a sudden, from nowhere, there it was. Never been there before. It wasn't a spore of it before, and after it was, in some sense, having an effect. And oddly enough, this is the very same thing the psychological subject is looking for in the healment process, instead of actually changing his or her action, thereby changing the thinking, which is inevitable. Because if you change your action, your thinking will change. Because the reason for action is thinking. This is what starts action. And everything in this world is part action, part intention, and part consequence. The only exception is the completely random, unwanted, in the sense it was not willed, unwanted, unintentional chiasma that cannot be defined, and we need to deconstruct it instead. And healing that thing that never ever in some ways could be unhealed, can never be parted in a real sense. And let's imagine this person realizes what he has to do is change his habits, his active thinking changes with the changing of the habits. They are allowed to be completely different, but at the same time being simultaneously the same. And there is no law of the excluded middle anymore hindering him from realizing that. And this shows how important at some step in this process is to have a realization. And I wouldn't call this enlightenment, but somewhere on the line you need to realize, by fighting the division or criticizing it, oh my God, even worse, to define it, you are treading water. You're making something out of something that doesn't have anything. For to be something, it needs to be partly willed and it needs to be partly out there. But it can never ever be completely only either or. And it's this either or that we had in passivity we mentioned many times before. And there is a sense of either or here. You either the observer or you the observed. And we predicate different qualities to the two sides. One is decided and usually more important, and even in modern days making up the thing looking at it. And the other one takes the lesser stand. It's sitting on the observer stand. It's looking at the scene. It is not participating. It's not in the dance. It's not non-doing anything. It is absolutely, positively passive, non-observant, non-doing, non-engaged in some way. It is just barely standing, doing nothing. And in this very process of doing nothing, that is how it devolves. Therefore you get this sense of nothing is happening. Nothing is doing anything. Yasu.
Γεια σου φίλε.
Hola kala.
Όλα καλά εσύ?
Kala.
Από
Πολύ
πού
καλά.
είσαι, από πού είσαι? Where are you from?
Ah, Σουηδία.
Σουηδία.
Σουηδία, ναι.
Ωραία η Σουηδία.
Ευχαριστώ. Μπορέι. So instead you are active in the process. And being active, you also have something that becomes more and more solid. Something that becomes firm. It has definitions. It has properties. It has a liveliness. It has a living feeling to it. And in this living feeling, you enter reality. And you all of a sudden realize that this thing I in the beginning called division never ever existed in any way. It wasn't there. And it wasn't even an illusion, because an illusion is somebody who's having an illusion. And what could happen to the poor person that is self-obsessing, ruminating about what is the stand on his mental health in this projected idea that the psyche is like the body or the bone that is wounded, and you establishing more and more the whole idea that it's firm, you have something, you suffer from something, and it becomes something in that process. And that becoming of something leads to an acceptance that you have something, and already this is established now. And it has already starting to affect your body, because that happens directly. Tension starts to spread in the dorsal area, and laxity becomes the model for what's happening in the ventral part. And your whole system starts to wiggle. It's not as sure anymore. It is not as stable anymore. And it's lacking this wondrous, fantastic direction of going somewhere. And you see, the intention can only be stopped by something random, something arbitrary, because that's the only thing in the universe that doesn't have intention. And it doesn't, in some ways, even exists. But how do you treat something that doesn't exist? Well, that's the tricky part, and that's deconstruction. And this, dear friends, was my very first take on deconstruction. Take it or leave it, but it was a tryout. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.